Hi, thank you so much for joining us for this very important conversation with two people that I followed for quite some time, and I'm very interested in hearing more about as we try to get our heads around this moment in our time and try to unravel so many of the issues that have occupied so many conversations and move towards a solution to making this world a better place than it was when we all arrived. With me, I have Alicia Garza. She is one of the co-founders of the Black Lives Matter Global Network, and she's a principal at Black Futurist Lab. And we also have Michael Eric Dyson, a professor at Georgetown University and author of Tears We Cannot Stop, A Sermon to White America. There's so many places we can start right now, but I'm very interested in just hearing from you all when you look back on the past month, we should say, or at least past 3 or 4 weeks that have led to a national uprising and deep disgust and concern with anti-Black racism and white supremacy across the country in places that we perhaps have never seen this type of response. What are some of the first things and thoughts that come to your mind, Alicia?
Well, first and foremost, it's amazing to see twice in my lifetime now such transformation happening across the country. I know when I talk to my elders, there's a sense that everything is possible right now. And that is also true when I talk to folks in my peer group. I think that, while this is an incredible moment of uprising and an incredible moment of reckoning, I really long for this to also be a moment for change. I think there are a lot of rules that have been rigged against Black communities for a very long time that we need to see the courage and drive the political will to actually start to shift. I think the other thing that's really important right now that is finally becoming a robust national and global conversation is a conversation around policing and safety in our communities. And I feel really good about the reckoning and the grappling that is happening right now, whether you feel comfortable or uncomfortable with the slogan of defund the police. I think it's important for us to be grappling with what actually keeps communities safe in this moment. And when it comes to Black communities in particular, is safety only achieved through punishment, or is safety achieved through making sure that we fix and rebuild the infrastructure that has been denied Black communities for so long?
What about you, Professor Dyson? What are some of the first things that come to your mind about this moment?
Well, like Ms. Garza, it is striking that we have seen yet another uprising, rebellion, resurgence, and revival of a spirit of resistance that has barely been seen in this country since the civil unrest of the 1960s. And it is directly attributable to the work that Ms. Garza and her colleagues have done by ingeniously fostering an environment where a hashtag becomes a statement and principle, an ideal, an aspiration, and a movement. I mean, that's remarkable. That's like joining Chuck Berry, Martin Luther King Jr., Ida B. Wells Barnett, and throwing in some Aretha Franklin. That's just a convergence of so many different aspects of our identities. The civil rights movement stated the goal, the aspiration to gain voting rights in 65, before that, civil rights in 64, and then in the aftermath of Dr. King's death, the Fair Housing Act. But Black Lives Matter is the articulation of an ideal. It's the articulation of a principle. It's the articulation of an aspiration. And it's the articulation of a reaffirmation to Black people. Yeah, Black Lives Matter, and they ought to matter. And to see what's going on now, the pushback of Black people to insist that this is the moment. People keep asking me, well, what's different now? What's different now is, it's different now. It's different because I've been doing interviews all over the world. They didn't do that before on Mike Brown, and Mike Brown had a national circumference within which his memory took place. But this is a global, if you will, acknowledgement. To match the global pandemic, it's a global explosion of consciousness. And that is attributable to our young, brilliant Black people like Ms. Garza and others who have led the way. Young people have always led the way. SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, John Lewis, Diane Nash, Julian Bond, led, of course, by many leaders at multiple sites. It is not a leaderless organization. It is a multiple site of leadership that is articulating goals, ideals, and aspirations. So I am heartened when I see the world has finally caught up to where Black people have been. And I can imagine some Black people are tired. And I tell white people, if you meet one Black person that's tired, go on to the next one. Because we running a relay here. So somebody had the baton and they wore out. But the next person running the leg may not be worn out. So Black communities are heterogeneous, they are differentiated, they are complicated and nuanced. And it is a time not only for white supremacy to be assaulted, which I'm glad, it is not only a time for the dominant white supremacist ideology to be attacked, it is also time for Black people to look inward and understand the resources at our disposal and in connection with other people who have joined the movement. And hallelujah, you got Latinx people, you got Asian folk, you got First Nation folk, you got indigenous folk, you got the Rainbow Coalition for real joining the movement. So when I look out and I see the devastating denial of Black life, Black death as the premise and predicate of American democracy, which it has been, the death of Black aspiration, which is what slavery was about, reinforcing an ideal that we were nothing, to see the uprising of Black people and claiming global recognition has been a remarkable thing. And despite the deaths of Miss Breonna Taylor and Mr. George Floyd and Mr. Ahmaud Arbery and so many countless others, trans people, women, and Black men alike, we have at this moment the possibility of truly and fundamentally transforming politics of police. And I think, and I'll end by saying, yes, Ms. Garza is right. You might be uncomfortable with the notion of defunding the police, but you might not be uncomfortable with the results of what that means. We done tried everything else. We done tried police community relations. We've tried enhancing relations between law enforcement and Black communities. We've tried making them live in the same neighborhood so that they will see a difference. That ain't helping. This is not a policy problem. It is a philosophical problem, and it is a culture problem. The immediate response to see me as a threat and to demonize me, we've got to purge out of the consciousness of these white folk and others, Black people as well, and brown and red and yellow people who police us, an instinct to murder us. You know, when you're driving along, and they've done these psychological studies, when you see somebody come across your horizon, the first thing is to drive toward them before you drive away from them. And so with Black people, we have been that object. You may not be for defunding the police, but I want to take the fun out of killing us. I want to take the fun out of murdering and massacring us. And I want to fund those programs and policies like the ones put forth by Ms. Garza and others that will have the chance of transforming this society in which we live. I will not talk this long again ever, but I had to get that out. I had to recognize Garza. I had to recognize Black Lives Matter, and I had to recognize the moment we're in.
Absolutely. I remember I was a political reporter in 2012 after the Trayvon Martin killing, which was my introduction to Black Lives Matter. I was in Phoenix, Arizona, and it was, as you know, Phoenix is not a place with a bustling, large Black population. So you would hear about it, but it wasn't what was happening to the degree that we saw in, you know, metropolitan areas with large Black populaces. But then I remember Mike Brown in Ferguson. By that time, I was up in grad school in Boston, and I saw so many protests and responses, and there was attraction that was happening. But this time I saw marches in Alaska and Idaho and Wyoming. And you know, Ms. Garza, I would just love to hear your thoughts as someone who has seen Black Lives Matter go from being painted as this fringe movement by its opponents to this idea and this value that recent surveys say the majority of Americans are behind. What's your thought and your reaction to that?
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. And judging by what my email inboxes look like, threats and praise alike, I can say that this is 100% a different moment. I think one of the things that I'm grappling with, though, is not around, where were Black folks at, because I feel like Black folks are very clear about the fact that Black lives should matter, and we may have different approaches to how we do that. But I will say that 7 years later, it is important to see white folks now joining this movement. I think there are folks who might say things like, where have y'all been? Because we have been here for almost a decade. But I will also echo the sentiments of Professor Dyson and say that, it's important that you're here now. And the question that I think I grapple with a lot in this moment, when we look at the trajectory and the history of Black Lives Matter, and also the embracing of it now, is that it really is up to us to make this a moment that we capitalize on. And by capitalize, I don't mean, everybody slap Black Lives Matter on your website or on a t-shirt and profit off of it. What I mean here is to actually make Black Lives Matter where you are. The fact of the matter is, if we were together right now in Aspen, we would be having this conversation, right, with an audience that actually doesn't look like this panel. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think actually what needs to happen here is that, when we talk about divesting from systems that don't benefit us, we also have to divest from practices and procedures and policies that don't benefit us either. And so part of what divesting looks like in this case would actually be to figure out, not just how do we diversify our environment, but how do we change how we lead in this moment? How do we change who is leading us in this moment? How do we change how we direct resources and power in this moment? And how do we also shift the way that we understand what Black Lives Matter can mean in our immediate environment, as well as in our communities and in our country and across the globe? And I make this point in particular because I think that, again, judging by what my inbox looks like, both threats and praise, what is true is that there is a major backlash that's happening to the popularity of Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter has not been as mainstream as it is right now. In 2013, when we started Black Lives Matter and leading all the way up until the 2016 election, saying Black Lives Matter was almost like political suicide. And that's why you couldn't get any major candidate to say it without taking a gulp of water first, right? Because they were very worried about the perceptions that were attached to and wrapped around Black Lives Matter. Of course, we have not been concerned about that because we've always known that we've been on the right side of history. But I can say, just to make a quick parallel, that in the same way that people would tell us now to change the slogan of defund the police to make the police better or transform the police or whatever, people told us this also in 2013 and said, well, how can you make your slogan more appealing to people like me? And I'm really glad that we didn't change our slogan to All Lives Matter or Black Lives Matter too. We've got to be able to, as a part of the reckoning that this moment is offering us, we have to be able to sit with the discomfort of the shifts that we are being asked to make right now. And so lastly, I just want to say that for me, when it comes to reimagining what this moment can and should look like, it also means reimagining the role of white folks in our communities and in our decision-making bodies. It means reimagining the roles in which decision makers have taken up that frankly have disenfranchised Black communities from being able to make decisions about our own lives, and to be able to do that in partnership and in interdependence. I want to be very clear here and very specific that policing is just the tip of the iceberg. Rules and practices and policy and culture needs to shift in our boardrooms and our C-suites, in our schools, in our economy, all throughout our society. So don't think that to be a part of Black Lives Matter, all you need to do is slap it on a t-shirt or on your website or send out an email talking about, how you're committed to diversity and inclusion. Actually think about what that looks like in your boardrooms. Think about what it looks like in your churches and in your workplaces and in your homes. You can make Black Lives Matter exactly where you are right now.
Indeed. I think one of the most interesting things about this moment is seeing the conversation focus on policing, but go beyond issues of public safety as well. Some of the more interesting conversations I've been following have been about the silencing of Black people in the mainstream media, Black and racial issues within the context of white evangelicalism and racism within LGBT communities as well. It's just been incredibly broad in terms of people needing to vocalize how Black lives have not mattered as much as they should have in so many different spaces. And I was very interested, Professor Dyson, as someone who's working with multiple generations, be they, younger millennials and Generation Z, but also your colleagues and your elders. What are some of the new conversations you're hearing that inspire you that perhaps were not being as entertained during previous generations?
Yeah, it's a great question. Look, first of all, Black lives have to matter to Black people. And Black lives have to matter in Black minds, right? You remember Martin Luther King Jr. near the end of his life saying, "I'm Black and I'm beautiful." I mean, the predecessor linguistic move before Black Lives Matter that was this national and this branded in both the good and uplifting senses of that word, and with the commercial and commodified consequences, is Black is beautiful, right? Right. So Black is beautiful was not only an assertion of an aesthetic ideal, it was the assertion of an internal spiritual orientation that permitted us to embrace the beauty of Blackness across the globe and across the spectrum, because we were seen as nasty and ugly, light versus dark, and what was seen as more appealing and what was seen as more demonized. So Black Lives Matter is such an ingenious moment, because the moment becomes a movement, and the moment becomes a means by which we begin to interrogate our own self-destructive practices and the way in which we ain't acknowledge it. So we can be homophobic in Black and say Black Lives Matter, but we're dogging the trans people. And trans people are dying in our communities in devastating ways. We can acknowledge that the overwhelming majority of people who are being killed by police at a certain level are Black men, but to also talk about the way in which Black women's bodies have been policed in so many other ways, not just by the police, right? And so, and let me put in a word here, it's important, and then I'll answer your question for sure. It's important that we talk about the police first, because if you ain't here, you can't have no argument in corporate America. If you ain't here, you can't go to church. If you dead, you ain't got no conversation. You're being conversed about, but you don't have a conversation to have. So this is why it's important to start with the police, because if I can't assume that when you stop my car fishing for a reason to get me into trouble, and then it ends with, like Walter Scott with me being killed, Sandra Bland with me being dead 2 or 3 days later, then we don't have the baseline of protection that allows us to move forward. So it's extremely important to do that. And by the way, the police issue is one that joins Black Lives Matter, Ms. Garza et al., with an Al Sharpton. Reverend Al Sharpton, right? We talk about Big Luther, Small Luther. We talk about Big Al, Small Al. We talk about still had the same hair, cold-blooded. He had the James Brown follicular fidelity because he paid homage to the man who loved him. And he said, if you love me, then put your hair like mine. So Al Sharpton, if you turn it to sideways and look at a silhouette, I dare you to tell me the difference between Al Sharpton and George Washington. Oh boy. That's a political re-excavation, an excavation of a political orientation that's deeply entrenched in American democracy. That gives new meaning to Whig and Tory. But anyway, I digress. The point is that Al Sharpton, when he was in those running suits, and when Negroes thought he was out of control and he ain't our leader and he doesn't have the right class, he was talking about police brutality. Bourgeois Negroes thought that's for you Negroes in the street who be messing up. Those of us who abide by the law shall not be attacked. God darn it, and it seems that is everywhere. It metastasized. So Al Sharpton was really a point man for a prescient understanding that the central argument about Black life in terms of a post-civil rights 1960s movement would be the police. Garza et al. Come along and they revive that sense, but reinfuse it with new meaning. Now they began to attach layers of gender, of sexual orientation, of class, and they began to articulate the necessity for a new generation to grasp hold of this. So in the minds of my colleagues and the people who are responding, Miss Garza is so right. Why give up on the language that allowed you to articulate an ideal so deep and profound that you knew it was doing something because it made white folk uncomfortable and it made comfortable Negroes uncomfortable. So for me, it's extremely important to hold fast to that. Look at Colin Kaepernick. 4 years ago, bowing down on the gridiron, trying to be respectful. Mr. Nate Boyer tells him, hey, I'm a veteran. If you want to honor veterans, then kneel. And so he did that. He was demonized. Now the man has got a statue somewhere. He might be up there next to Kobe and Magic Johnson somewhere. Now they want to put him on a dollar bill. Okay, that's a lie. But what I'm saying is that there is a transition suddenly, but the sudden is not sudden. The sudden is a buildup. Black Lives Matter was the wave that crashed against white supremacy for 150 years. Miss Garza and her colleagues simply named it. And when they named it, they were able to give it an identity, and that identity had seen it through. Yes, there is resistance. Yes, there is nastiness. You know, look, I've been getting death threats for 32, 34 years. I've been out here doing it. They didn't have Facebook. They didn't have Twitter. They just wrote your old-fashioned nasty notes, and then they saw you in the street. There's that nigger. Yeah, that's me. I'm the one. I'm the one. Yep, NWA. That's what I do. So the reality is, in my time and with my colleagues and with older people, we look and we celebrate what is going on with this movement, politically, socially, spiritually, metaphysically, and I think symbolically. All that brought together, and my generation says, hats off. We acknowledge what's going on. We want to continue to forge connections. And it's upsetting a lot of white folk, but it's also setting a lot of white folk right. And they have a language to hold on to. And it's something that's precise and concise for them to say, yeah, Black Lives Matter. And that notion, if they keep saying it, even as a mantra. And I know Ms. Garza said, don't just put it on your shirt, but put it on your shirt. Don't just put it on your website, put it on your website. Don't just put it on your books, put it on your books. And also put it on something else, right? And I think that, look, it's like with romantic love. You can't live on romantic love for 30 years and 40 years. No, you can't, but you need it to start. And you need it as the kindling to be on the fire. So we need the branding of Black Lives Matter. That's the ingenuity of this generation. We need to Facebook and social media, all that stuff, but we need to connect it to deeper wells of social resistance and political intensity that allow us to leverage our history in new forms. So we have to thank Black Lives Matter as often as we can, because they've given us new energy, new insight, and new purpose for our social rebellion. And white folk are listening, and that's a good thing.
It is a good thing. And something else I believe this moment has given us is a deep awareness of the toll that being an advocate for racial equality has on someone mentally and physically and spiritually. And we're having conversations, as you noted, about the importance of self-care and taking care of yourself mentally in ways that perhaps were not as common. And it would be great to hear your insight and your counsel there.
I can start here. I mean, it's a very important question, and I think it's one that deserves a broad answer. I have to be honest that I have realized over the last decade that I can't yoga my way to care. I can't bubble bath my way to care. That actually care and caring and connection and interdependence is a cultural value that we have to adopt. If I'm doing my things to buy myself care, then there are still people in my community that can't access that. And so I like to talk about self-care as a function of community care. And I do the work that I can to make sure that the environments that I'm building, the work that I do at the Black Futures Lab and the Black to the Future Action Fund and other institutions and organizations, we really build into our culture that we need people to be long distance runners. And so what that means is a different mindset and approach, right, to how we do this work and connecting to purpose, right, in addition to connecting to outcomes. So, every week when my team and I are talking about the work that we're getting ready to move, we start with just checking in with each other. What do people need? Are you feeling anxious? How can we show up for you? And that's different than telling people to take a day off or take a week off or take a bubble bath or sending somebody a pass for yoga. And I think this is important because so often, at least over the last decade, there's been lots of debates about self-care and, whether or not self-care is accessible, whose idea is that? People quote Audre Lorde, but then they quote her wrong. Um, we have to understand that, part of what it means to be an act of political warfare is to change the way that we orient and organize ourselves around the work that has to be done. The work of changing policies and changing laws is not separate from the work of changing culture and changing our relationships to each other that have been shaped by systems that deem us disposable. And so if we are adopting those practices and habits and trying to wash over them and call them something that they're not without fundamentally changing them, then we are literally just advancing a political agenda that is not ours and it's not beneficial to us. And so in this moment where we are constantly pivoting because the systems that organize our lives are actually deeply unsustainable, and so they tend towards crisis, we have to do a readjustment of ourselves in this moment, not just to provide mutual aid, which is important, not just to make sure that people are caring for themselves, which is important, but to actually change our practices so that care is at the center of the work that we do externally and internally. And it provides infrastructure or a safety net, as some people might say, to, not just the freedom fighters who are out in the streets right now, but all of the people who are working to make social change real. And so we have to, I think, readjust our way of understanding care from an individual's responsibility to access as they can to environments and cultures that we nurture, that care for each other as much as we care for ourselves.
Amen.
Professor Dyson, thoughts on self-care, how individuals can care for themselves as they're trying to engage these really difficult topics?
Well, Ms. Garza has brilliantly, eloquently articulated it. I'll just add a couple things. When we find the way to have radical, revolutionary Black joy in the midst of Black pain, then the therapeutic possibilities are opened up and we learn to embrace them without shame. Let's not shame each other, but let's embrace the possibility of our self-care because we care for each other. Self-care is critical, other care is mandatory, and we care for each other is the fundamental premise, I think, of Black survival in this country.
Well, it has been a joy and a privilege having you both with me, and I appreciate you caring enough about this topic to share your time with me and all of our listeners. And we hope to be able to continue this at another time and to follow both of you all on your journeys, on your work, and on social media.
Thank you, my friend. You do great work at the Washington Post, man. I read you all the time. You're brave, you're courageous, you're insightful, you're chocolate charming and handsome Hollywood, brother. You're doing your thing.